Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. Let me welcome the ambassadors of Colombia, Honduras, Canada, Estonia, India, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Slovenia. Let me welcome also the General Director for North America, Fidel Sendagorta, the Director of the Cabinet of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and also our member of the board, Antonio de Oyarzábal. And let me welcome especially Paula Dobriansky. Thank you, Paula. It's a great honor to have you this morning to discuss the world according to Trump, the world more or less. No? Let me introduce to you Paula Dobriansky. I don't have to introduce Ana Palacio. She's very much famous in Spain, and yesterday I learned that she's famous also in the US. That's what Paula told me. So she doesn't need any kind of introduction. But let me say a few words about Paula. Paula Dobriansky is a foreign policy expert, former diplomat specializing in national security affairs. She's a senior fellow at the Future of Diplomacy project at Harvard Kennedy's School. During her more than 25 years in national security affairs, Ambassador Dobriansky held many Senate-confirmed and senior-level positions in the US government. For example, she served as Undersecretary of State for Democracy and Global Affairs. She's a member now of the Council on Foreign Relations of the American Academy of Diplomacy. She has a degree in international politics from Georgetown University, a PhD in Soviet political military affairs from Harvard University. She has received many international recognitions from various countries, from Poland, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, and she has also several honorary doctorates. So we have an expert, as I said. We have two great experts on foreign relations. No? And let me start moving away from the media agenda over President Trump, filled with noise these days, and start with a general comment that I will end with a couple of questions addressed to both of you. First, Anna, if you want, and then to Paula. No? This general comments is the following. No? During 2, maybe 3 centuries, the United Kingdom first and the United States later were the leading countries in projecting Western values and institutions all over the world. Market economy, free trade, democracy, human rights, rule of law. These were the distinctive traits of these 2 countries. No? Many other countries and many citizens followed these 2 countries in the belief that these traits were the path to a good society, the best path to a good society. And both countries, of course, contributed strongly to create open societies on the one side, and on the other side, multilateral organizations and an international liberal order at the international level. No? Then suddenly, like black and totally unexpected swans, the first, UK with Brexit, and then apparently the United States with the election of the 45th president, Mr. Trump, have changed tack and seem to follow a different and maybe even an opposite direction. Seem to follow. Instead of projecting values and institutions, both seem to protect themselves from the penetration of the world, building walls and building barriers. The Mexican wall is kind of an icon of this change, of this supposed retrenchment of U.S. foreign policy. Yesterday, a few days ago, we learned about the new budget of the President Trump presented. And yesterday, for example, Colin Powell published in the New York Times an op-ed regretting strongly how has been reduced the budget for diplomacy and for U.S. aid, both tools, important tools of foreign policy and of projecting foreign policy for the United States. No? So let me ask both of you a first question, a couple of questions. No? Is this an accident or is it a trend? Is this just something that is going to disappear? Largely, to a great extent, Brexit happened because nobody expected it to happen. And that's why it took place, to a great extent. No? We can say also that in the US, Of course, Hillary Clinton won in terms of popular votes. Young people, and we can say probably the most dynamic part of US society, were for Hillary Clinton and not for Trump. So is this an accident in the political maturing of the United States, something that will disappear as time goes by, it will disappear as the economy recovers, or is it a long-term trend? Or to frame the question in other words, is the liberal international order over, as for example the British historian Niels Ferguson has sustained recently? Is it starting to fade? Well, that's my first address to both of you. That address is probably the most general way of entering into the issue. Anna first, and then Paula. Anna.
In my opinion, I would frame it the other way you have also addressed it. What about the international legal-based, institution-based order that was born after World War II, and that is what has shaped the world of today? So I was saying that the United States today is the indispensable power. If the United States retrenches, and I will make a difference between retrenchment and unilateralist position within the system. That is very different. And by the way, this is what, President Bush 43 was accused of unilateralism, but George Bush 43 was never accused of retrenchment. What the difference might be today is this idea of retrenchment. And I will give you just two examples. Please.
Thank you, Anna. Paula, it's your turn. Is the liberal international order over? Anna introduced a clever distinction between unilateralism and retrenchment. No? Is this administration unilateralist? Is it retrenched? Or we don't know yet, which is another possibility.
Well, first, Emilio, is my mic working? Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Emilio, first, let me say thank you. I'm really very delighted to be here, and especially delighted not only at the invitation of Elcano, but to be here with my dear, good friend and very respected friend, former Foreign Minister Ana Palacio. So I'm very pleased to be here. Let me take the question first, if I may, and put it in context. Why? Because the question of, is the liberal international order, I would say, being threatened? That's how I would frame it. And I will come to the United States and the position last. I think that the international liberal order is being challenged. But where are the challenges coming from? First, I would start with, if you look at a number of countries have spoken to the order, to the values, to the alliance, to the very institutions, which in my belief have held peace, security, and stability for decades. This order has been very important in the maintenance of peace, security, stability. In the Munich Security Conference, then President Putin spoke to the question of values. And he said and challenged that these values are not our values. We do not see ourselves as part of this. Since that time forward, and I want to say this because putting this in context, there have been other countries. I think that Russia has been the most vigorous in stating its differences and opposition to that order as it exists. But you also have China. China has also, in various fora, Xi Jinping has also made statements as to their perspective and differences with the order. Then you have, on the continent of Europe, we've seen that there have been many stresses and strains that have come about, not only from migration, which I think also had an impact on the issue of Brexit, but also the whole question of the Eurozone. And remember the whole financial crisis. Many of us remember that quite well. And also the issue of even reform. What reforms are being undertaken? I would add to that I think that the United States, with Europe, there's been a kind of complacency. A complacency that these institutions, these values, these alliances have been in place, and they have maintained us. But we also see that the world has changed. We are being very much confronted by new challenges, by new issues. And in that regard, I think that the issue is, there is a challenge here, but what I would put is, there's also an opening and an opportunity to bring about reforms, to have those institutions provide the foundation, the basis for going forward, but not in the exact same way as they have previously. I think, at least my impression is, in Europe, that many have called for example, reforms within the EU, and just the way in which business is done. And my impression is that the EU is looking at changes and reforms. Also, in the context of NATO. NATO has itself, I think, undergone a number of changes and discussions about where to go next. But back to the core point, the foundation is what should be maintained. I'm a strong believer in that international liberal order. I believe in those values, in those institutions and alliances. But I'm also a strong believer that there does need to be some adaptation and flexibility to the world in which we're in now. So let me come to the United States. When you look back at our elections, and I think we need to go back to our elections, I think we witnessed in the United States last year what I would call a political movement. And not just on the Republican side, but also on the Democratic side. I say that because Emilio mentioned the youth. It was very interesting to me that the youth flocked to Bernie Sanders. You mentioned in the end where they went, but there was a very strong turnout for the candidate Bernie Sanders. By the way, women galvanized around Trump. I don't know if you know that, but he got the highest proportion of women supporting him. But what we saw both with Republicans and Democrats was a political movement. What was the movement? I think people were reacting, by the way, in the United States, to something that did not, happen in the years before. When President Obama was our president, there was the term, as you know, leading from behind. And for the United States not taking a leadership role. You know there are many examples to point to this, Syria being one of the examples in which the United States gave certain signals and then drew a red line and then did not follow through. I think it was a mistake. There wasn't leadership. And it impacted our credibility. During the election, I think there were two things at work. One, people were looking at what was going on in the United States and what was happening abroad on questions of defense. For example, we put in monies in for defense for the NATO alliance. We put in monies into the United Nations. There are many other countries in both institutions that are also members. And questions were raised about how much do others care about this liberal international order and their stake in it as well. So I think what we have seen is a political movement, and one where the term, as you know, that President Trump came out with, which was America First. Let me say immediately, I think in contrast to the 8 years of the Obama administration, America First means and does not mean America will not lead internationally. It does not mean that. It does mean it will lead internationally. That's what it means. That you can be America first, and at the same time you can lead internationally and you can be engaged. But also what it means is, let's take a look at how we are all part of this. We are all stakeholders. We all have a responsibility in the preservation of these values, of these institutions and alliances. And I'll conclude on this note in particular. President Trump is in Brussels, and there's the NATO discussion and NATO meeting. And you know, on the table has been the issue of burden sharing. And see, that's what this is derived from, that the United States also has issues, pressures domestically that it must address, but also it is important that if we all care about these matters, there can't be a complacency. There has to be not just talking about the importance of it, but actually manifesting it in one's actions, in one's deeds. So that's the context. I would frame your question differently. And as for my outlook is, I think that the Trump administration will be very engaged internationally. I think it has also demonstrated a care and a concern about our national security, that of our friends and our alliances. The meeting that took place and the visit to the Middle East, I think, underscores the concern about the extremism and terrorism and the kinds of collective steps that need to be taken. And I think we're going to see more of that. But let me be clear, America first. Also, it's what it says, but also I see that America will be leading, will be engaged, but it will also be as an effort where we all have a stake in it, and not just only in terms of one country paying and putting forward the primary resources. That's the context here.
We will discuss later the Trump's trip in Brussels and his meetings with the European Union and NATO. Let's leave that for later. But if you want to say another comment?
It's
working.
Now, Paula, I mean, point taken, and I will start by saying that you are right. I mean, in terms of the Obama's foreign policy, you're absolutely right. But the thing, Obama had a logical America first, because it was just engaging where there was no other, and this idea you have mentioned, this idea leading from behind, you are right. The problem is that nowadays you have reality, and this is reality, and you have perception. The perception has changed, and the perception is not just change because of the evils of the classical media. The perception has changed because of certain signals. And I have mentioned this, the TPP, but not just the TPP. You can reframe or you can just take an approach. But this idea of radial politics, radial policies, which is what we are seeing. So it's United States engaging with X. In this case, in the case of trade, it's avoiding having as an interlocutor the European Union and trying to have as an interlocutor Germany, and that's a very different. You say our common, and this idea, no, we mean institutions. It's a very different. If United States engage in the war against the terrorism and all that, that's great. But that's not what we are, at least the way I see the institutions. And frankly, NATO. Hey, the first that said exactly what President Trump is saying was Gates, 2008, and his farewell speech of June 2010. More clearly, nobody has said it. Why the perception has changed? Because it was in a context of United States cares for NATO, and therefore you cannot have a free ride, you Europeans. Here it is I mean, I know that now President Trump has said that it's not any longer obsolete and we will go there. But here the perception is completely different. So the message is the same, the perception is different because of the approach to the institutional framework. And this is what is a concern and what I expect. And frankly, this 30% and there, Colin Powell's, fantastic, recommended. Read, if someone hasn't read it, it's a great op-ed. What he says is exactly that. How are you going to engage? To engage means to be present, to participate if you slash. And this is another very symbolic move.
Yes, of course. But I would like to end this point and move to the next one.
I wanted to make a few extra points because of Anna's. It might be worth noting and remembering, because Anna mentioned trade. During the campaign in the United States, on this question, by the way, both Republicans and Democrats did not have a different position, meaning the two finalists, meaning Trump and Hillary Clinton. On that question, particularly with regard to TPP, there was the issue that these were flawed agreements and they needed to be revamped. So I want to point that out because, again, of a perception of the kind of debate going on in our country and what are the roots of it. Because there were many, both Republicans and Democrats. And interestingly enough, Hillary Clinton before had taken the position in favor of. So I think we find many times that, there are politicians, they may take a position, they may evolve for different reasons. Part of it might be because of the views and the voice of citizens in one's country. But on the question of trade, if I may, because I think it's important, right now we're only in the first 100 days, just right past the first 100 days of this administration. The National Security Council has appointed someone who I happen to know. She is the person who is writing the national security strategy. And I think that we also, instead of prejudging because of maybe statements made in the heat of a campaign, whether by Democrats or Republicans, I think we need to step back and take a look at what is the strategy that is unfolded. And I think that is going to emerge, I would say, probably towards the end of the summer. But on these trade agreements, I think they are important. And what I am hearing is that many of these are under review. And why they're under review is because of the outcry from many of our own citizens saying that they were disadvantaged by some of these agreements. So how they will change precisely, I think, in some ways, remains to be seen a bit here. And then I'll just end on this. Anna mentioned, which, and Emilio mentioned about Colin Powell's op-ed. I think it is important that we are having this debate over the budget. And I think the points that are being made about the importance of the budget for our foreign policy do matter, because it has to be attached. But it's far from being over. That's what I'd say. And it's good that he, as a former Secretary of State, I think very eloquently made the case about the importance of aid and how that has to be coupled with our foreign policy, that you can't emasculate it. You probably heard the views of our members of Congress and what they've already said. So there's a debate going on. But where I'd say that the challenge of the budget is there are some values, because I'm sure here in Spain, I'll move this over. I'm sure here in Spain, should I use that? I'll use that. And my apologies.
¿Pueden poner el micrófono? Sí, ahí está.
My apologies. I'll just end on this note. I think that this question of reforms as well, meaning within the department and within our government, and no less questions of budget, there have been many redundancies. And it's good to have a review and to take a step. But I also think these perspectives that have been put out is also important. I do believe that you have to have a certain amount of aid coupled with your foreign policy objectives in order to be credible and to be meaningful and successful.
Let me move to another issue, more concrete, which is China-Russia, U.S.-China-Russia relations. Initially, it seemed that President Trump was turning on its head Nixon's policy, no? Whereas Nixon engaged with China, following Kissinger's advice to control Russia. It seems that he was going to do the opposite, no? Engaging with Russia to control China as the major threat. No? Is this still a policy? Is he changing mind as a consequence of some of the members of his cabinet? Is he simply following events as they unfold? What do you think about this apparent shift between the relation between China and Russia?
Thank you. First, I think that you look at each of our presidents, George W. Bush, Obama, President Obama, and President Trump, have all been very desirous of having a constructive relationship with Russia. And as you may recall, both George W. Bush and also President Obama put forward policies that were very intended to try to engage Russia and to have a constructive relationship. I think that I put that as background. I think that, and also to show in a context, I think that was President Trump's intent. But also, I think what we've witnessed is one of the also gravest foreign policy challenges that we have before us, which is North Korea. And when Xi Jinping came to the United States, there was a very specific exchange about this issue, about North Korea. As you know, China does have close relations, and particularly in terms of its economic and trade relationship. And so the discourse was very much focused on a number of issues, but definitively on that question of North Korea. And in that regard, I do think that as a result of that engagement, I think that the Chinese, at least by accounts, has tried to move and have some influence. For example, they stopped the coal exports into China, and there have been other measures that they're taking. So to answer your question, I think that right now we see what I would say is a process of engagement because of a very serious challenge that is facing not only Asia, but the global community in terms of the threat, the nuclear threat posed by North Korea. At the same time, I think that with regard to Russia, you know, Russia has been very much front and center in the United States and also here in Europe. Remember, in my response to the earlier question, which was about the liberal international order, the issue about influencing elections or, you know, using different kinds of media, disinformation, of trying to influence publics, that's going on. That's been going on, not only here in the continent of Europe, but also in the United States. And I will say that that's something of grave concern, and that's something that there's been tremendous pushback about Russia for those actions. And no less, I'd add, although you didn't ask it, but another very graphic challenge to that international liberal order was the fact of the illegal annexation of Crimea here on the continent of Europe, when we expect a rules-based order that occurred during the time of President Obama. and then no less the invasion of Ukraine. And in that context, I think that also flies in the face of the preservation of the international liberal order. So where are we now? I think that in terms of what I see what I would call a very realistic approach, an approach of, on one hand, engaging with China because of the threat from North Korea, and I would say with regard to Russia, I think that it has been a very cautious one.
Yeah. Let me remember in that context that already Obama tried to engage with Russia. And he used the expression reset the relations. Then he failed completely. And he failed completely precisely because the invasion of Crimea and the events unfolding in Ukraine. But these events took place before Trump started again to reset with Russia. No? Let me move again to China and North Korea. Probably North Korea is the major threat now in geopolitical and security terms for the world. And a question, Anna, you can answer that, too, of course, whenever you want, Paula. To what extent is North Korea following an independent path in terms of foreign policy, or to what extent it is simply a tool used by China somehow to blackmail the West? Is it simply a chance, a luck that a few days after President Trump announced trade barriers to Chinese goods, suddenly North Korea started to send missiles to the air once every 2 or 3 weeks? Is just by chance, or is there a kind of understanding, hidden understanding? Can you believe really that North Korea is not a state somehow controlled indirectly by a big neighbor?
Emilio, you know too well that in international politics sometimes, but very rarely, things happen just by chance. These are acts of God, but not the sudden change in policy of North Korea. Well, let me just start by saying something. And you know, Paula, that we have discussed this issue, and I'm happy, by the way, that you have brought all your expertise in Ukraine. But in general terms, I'm going to repeat something that I have said to my American interlocutors, and I don't have to prove my Atlanticist credentials and my admiration for this great country. The problem is that, when you are a great country like the United States, when you are the indispensable country, you cannot go on being binary. For the United States, the immediate, and I'm looking at our, until very recently, ambassador in the United States, that I had the great honor that he served with me, and we have had this conversation many times. This idea that for the United States is just binary relations. So now with China is North Korea. Okay, no. A power like the United States has to have, and in fact has to acknowledge that there are engagements in different areas, and that you are playing in different chess games with the same interlocutor, but several chess games. So this is something that comes once and again, and for us Europeans, and this is not just for us Spaniards, but for us Europeans, and I think for many of your friends and allies around the world, this is always something that surprises us. My second comment is that I think that we, on China, we haven't mentioned what, for me, from this perspective of the big challenge, and you are right, the big challenge that we have on the international world order are two declarations by Xi Jinping. The first is the declaration in Marrakesh when there are news coming from the White House. We are not speaking about campaign, we are speaking about policies now. Frankly, the declarations of the campaign is one thing. We are speaking about declarations now, and what I said about Angela Merkel was last week. Not at all. I'm trying to have again, a binary, a radial thing. This idea with Germany and not with the European Union, that's not campaign. It's here. But what I'm saying in general term is that Xi Jinping, with respect to when it was COP23 in Marrakesh, he said, oh, here I am, we are going to be leading in this. Why? Because United States had left this vacuum by making a declaration, we are considering seriously to withdraw from Paris. Second example, Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum in Davos saying, here I am, I'm the champion of the free world. I mean, come on, for us it's this challenge on the international institutional legal order. It's an oxymoron. I mean, Xi Jinping, champion of the free world, for us, simply, it's an oxymoron. So, you asked me about what I think concretely about North Korea. I have responded very simply, things do not happen by chance, and especially things that have to do with China are just always, you have A, B, and A going to B with shadows of having BA, and all this complex issue. And I think that this is for the United States, for us as well, this is for the United States to address clearly.
I expect an answer from you, Paula, also about this small conspiracy theory I am building about North Korea. But I would like to rise and move a little deeper on the question of China. Probably the most important thing to address for the next 50 years, probably for the 21st century, is to what extent can China rise peacefully? That's probably the most important issue for the next 50 years. I mean, I'm talking about the so-called Thucydides trap. Are we condemned necessary to a confrontation between an emerging country and a slowly declining or relatively declining country? Again, can China rise peacefully and find a place and create a place? We all remember that when something like that happened at the end of the 20th century, when three big countries emerged, Germany, Japan, and the US, that produced not one but two world wars. Are we condemned to this kind of trend to make again the same mistakes, or we can create enough room for China?
Thank you. I think that question really depends on a number of factors. First, for China's own direction itself. Right now, there are concerns about China's own direction. It has been investing substantially in its navy and in its military. Secondly, we know also the kind of contest that occurs over the islands in the South China Seas, and countries in the region have expressed concerns about China's intentions, that they remain of concern because of not just only these islands, but because of the military investment. And then we even look back, if you look back on the actions of Burma, when Burma cut its strong ties before with China, because there was also a feeling of a kind of strong economic stranglehold. So I think that I'd start with first, China has an opportunity and has been in fact called upon to be a constructive international player and stakeholder. So one, it does depend on some of their own actions. Secondly,
but do you think that now is playing okay, China? I mean, up to now, has China been playing?
I think, as I just said,
the rules?
No, there have been the countries, I think I've just indicated, the countries of the region have expressed concern. All right, they've expressed concern because of the military investments, because of the disputes over the islands, and because of what they deem to be also not fair in terms of economic economic framework. So right now, no, but you asked, can it be? So I was trying to answer that the hypothetical, it depends on its actions. But right now, it doesn't look at all like it's going in that direction. Secondly is, I think it depends on also what we do. Anna just mentioned before, and I agree with her very, very much. She mentioned the importance of alliances and partnerships, that it's not just about bilateral or binational. The art of diplomacy, you have to step back and you look at how you can wield influence. Sometimes some countries might have greater influence than others, or might have certain special relationships over others. But you need to work together. So we need to work towards that goal. But right now, no, I don't see that happening just because of what the trends are at present. With regard to North Korea, I think we have traditionally, certainly with the six-party talks, the first Bush administration and the Obama administration has strived to engage North Korea and engage China. But we haven't gotten very far. And I think this is a tough question, and that's why I also think when our Secretary of Defense, Mattis, and also Secretary of State Tillerson went out there, they both talked about the options being on the table, all these options, because there's grave concern about what will unfold here.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move to Europe. Europe, NATO. As we know, President Trump is now today in Brussels. He's having meetings with Jean-Claude Juncker, with Donald Tusk, with Federica Mogherini. He's going to visit NATO this afternoon, I guess, and he's going to give a speech there. What can we expect from this travel? I mean, the evident question is NATO obsolete or is not obsolete? Is it still the major ally, the major alliance for the security of the world, for the United States and for the European Union? Is it a hellhole? I think that was the word he used once. It's an old-fashioned, outdated institution or not? Who wants to start? Anna, Paula, okay.
NATO matters. And I think by the statements that the president has made, also his top national security advisors, they underscore that the alliance matters, NATO matters. And this goes back to the very first question about the preservation of the international liberal order. In that context, our alliance does matter. At the same time, I think it's also crucial, as I mentioned, three things actually. One, we need to be looking at the deterrent value of NATO and how we put that together. We need to be looking about the burden sharing. I've already referenced that. And we also need to be looking about, the threats before us and the kind of adaptability of NATO in its mission regarding the kinds of threats that confront us, all of us.
Anna, is she...
Very short. I think that this is a very important trip, although we cannot expect in NATO, it has already been announced that there will be no conclusions, no nothing. But it's very important because of what we said at the beginning. Perception. Well, what is this message about the symbolism that the President of the United States of America and the presidency of the United States of America is an institution in itself, is a pillar of this international world order, that the presidency just acknowledges by his presence, by meeting with Tusk, by meeting with the institutions in Brussels. We all know, it has been widely commented that his first question when Tusk called him to congratulate him was, who is the next? What is the next country to lead the European Union? I think that by going there, by meeting them, he's sending a very important message, not from Donald Trump, but from the presidency of the United States of America. NATO matters, European Union matters. And frankly, I welcome it. And for me, this is the value.
Okay, apparently we start to have two personalities, Donald Trump on the one side and the President of the United States on the other side, and that's not easy to reconcile. But okay, one question to you, Paula. You're an expert on security matters. The problem with NATO is a problem of spending more, or is it a problem of spending better? As Anna recalled just now, Robert Gates' speech, a strong speech in Brussels in 2010, I guess, it was June 2010, where he warned the European Union, no? And he was right in a sense. We are not sharing the burden in a fair way, and I agree with that. No? But the question is it a question of spending more again or spending better? Because if I'm not wrong, right now the European Union spends in defense 3 times more than Russia, more or less. And we can obviously see what's the difference in the use of that strength, in the use of that money. So, what do you think about that?
I think it may be both, in fact, because I think always spending better in being efficient and looking at what your challenges are and how to deal with it, that's always the best way to start with. But I wouldn't remove aside spending more if it requires it. Yeah. Again, we're in an environment that has challenged us. I think that when we look back with the invasion of Ukraine and also the illegal annexation of Crimea, and then I think about the Nordic countries, those that are NATO members and those that are not NATO members, the question they raise, what are these provocations vis-a-vis them? And what if there is a kind of hybrid warfare that takes place, or some kind of provocation that doesn't exactly fall in the parameters of Article 5 of NATO? So, I think it's both, genuinely. But I think, in my view, I think the very good thing, I'm very glad for this visit. I think that, as Anna said, I think it sends a very important signal and underscores the importance attached to NATO. But I also think that, as I said earlier, it's not only about NATO, but the EU, and even in our own domestic situations, I think we need to be looking at how we reform ourselves to deal with the kinds of challenges, cyber, counterterrorism strategies, new kinds of warfare. All of these things matter, and how resilient are we? How have we adapted ourselves to it? So it's both, to answer your question.
Okay, let's move to a final question before opening the floor to the audience for questions and answers. I would like to commend both of you on Latin America. As you know, Spaniards feel very close to Latin America, also to Mexico, of course, also to the Latino community in the U.S. So we were not very happy with some comments that Donald Trump, I don't know if the president, but Donald Trump made about bad hombres and rapists and things like that. No? An issue where internal and external questions are mixed. I would like to know, is there a position of the present administration in relation to Latin America, and of course also a serious position on the question of migrants, internal and external, but mainly about Latin America?
How about you? You want me to go first? Okay. Okay, all right. I thought we'd go back and forth, but our relationship and partnership with Latin America is important to us. It's our neighbor, just as Canada's our neighbor, so the North and the South matter. Let me mention 2 things that you may or may not know. Before I came here, by the way, in the newspaper, it was mentioning that as a result of the trip that our Secretary of State Tillerson and our Secretary of Homeland Security, Kelly, took to Mexico, by the way, to discuss the border question, to sit down, to have perspectives, to ventilate, to hear the different viewpoints. One of the things that has emerged is cooperation and collaboration on anti-drug trafficking. That does relate also to this question of the border and migration. It was stated that they have agreed to have a consultative process to sit down and to go over this, and also to have these issues factor into how one deals with security of the border. So I will say this. Again, where are we now? That's what I'm going to address. I think we're in a space where there is a desire to be reviewing the situation, to look at how one can go forward, where the benefits are going to benefit our neighborhood. Not only us, but also Mexico and the neighborhood at large. That is, I think, very, very important. Secretary Kelly, our head of Homeland Security, some of you may also know, actually was formerly the head of our Southern Command. And every leader in Latin America, actually, who was there during his tenure, knows him. I know this because we were just at an event in his honor at the Embassy of Colombia, by the way, in Washington, D.C., and he has a clear understanding. I share this because I do think it also matters in terms of the people who are on the front lines of implementing policy, the tone, the tenor, and the kinds of solutions that they look for. So I feel that this is moving forward on a very measured path.
Do you think that the wall is finally going to be built or not? Because it's a terrible icon.
You know what?
Terrible.
Secretary Kelly has been asked this question. I don't deal with Homeland Security, but let me give you his answer. He said it might be a mix. It depends on what part. There might be a fence, there might be a wall, there might be technical equipment. He said, we're going to work this with the Mexicans. We're going to have a discussion back and forth. And again, I noticed this recent article, which I thought, and I wanted to share that, and I'm glad you asked the question, because to me that's related to some of the border issues. It's not just only the pure issue of, migration, but it's also the issue of which, by the way, in the article it said the United States will have to address the question of demand, and which has been an issue for us. And then on the other side, of course, these narco-trafficking rings and how one deals with them. So it's a good thing that this has been established with our relevant agencies.
And to what extent, Anna, do you think that Donald Trump's discourse may have somehow stigmatized the Latin America community and the Latino community inside the U.S. because he made some very strong statements?
Well, you're right. Again, we are in this distinction between perception and reality. By the way, I would like to start by something which we have to dispel. The wall is not an issue of Trump. It's not a creation of Trump. There are parts of walls that have been built by different presidents. And frankly, the thing is that as with the free ride for Europeans in NATO, everybody just blames Trump, forgetting that this is not from yesterday, as I said. So this is the first thing. But again, why this perception? Why this perception? This perception is extremely important. People forget about the reality and keep the perception. And in that respect, I think that it is clear that Trump has surrounded himself by an exceptional team of militaries. I know one of them personally, and I mean, know him, not that I'm friends with him, but I know him. I think it's fantastic. One caveat, though, is an American military is a military, and the president is the commander-in-chief. So we have seen lately McMaster contorting in declarations. I think that this loyalty, it's entrenched in the military culture, is there. I don't want to duck your question. I mean, I was outraged at the moment, as all in Spain were, because we feel very close to this community, because frankly, the Latino community, and we know that the Latino goes beyond Hispanic and goes, of course, beyond Spain, but nevertheless, we, Spain, are your American other big heritage. We constitute it, and I'm looking at you. This is, and our foundation, that Ambassador Lejarreta is the secretary, and Casa America, I suppose, this is entrenched in us, this highlighting the importance of this Latino community. I personally think that their reality is so strong. This is such a strong community, such a vibrant community, such an indispensable community within the life of the United States, that this has not really permeated, because Americans know best, and frankly, this is not among the declarations of Trump. Now, one last comment, and I know that you're looking, one last comment is that if President Trump really means this big infrastructure project, I wonder how he's going to do that without the Latino community and frankly, immigration from Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just one comment to what you say. Certainly, many countries build walls. Spain has a wall, as we all know, in Africa. But you can build a wall boasting about it, or you can build a wall in a very humble way. And that creates a difference in the narrative and how do you say it to the people in general. I think let me turn to Spanish. Tenemos algo más de 15 minutos, probablemente 20 minutos, que podemos utilizar para preguntas y respuestas. Os pido que levantéis la mano, lo iré distribuyendo como pueda. Perdonadme, seguro que no todo el mundo puede intervenir. Y lo que sí os pido es que os presentéis inicialmente y habléis despacio para que los traductores puedan hacer su trabajo y Paula pueda enterarse de lo que estáis diciendo. Por lo tanto, tenemos una intervención allí. Hay un... ¿Is it working? No, espera, antes de nada, vamos a ver si la traducción simultánea funciona. No sé cuál es el canal de la traducción simultánea del inglés. You don't hear? It's not working? Okay, can you speak in English?
Of course.
Sí? Okay, well, let's continue with English.
All right. First of all, let me thank Minister Palacio, Secretary Dobriansky, and of course, President Lamo de Espinosa for this interesting session at the Royal Institute. Well, this is not the first time.
Can you present yourself?
Oh yes, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I'm Jose Maria de la Torre from the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. This is not the first time we talk about President Trump at the Royal Institute, and I'm pretty sure it won't be the last. You know, what I have said along all these months talking about President Trump is that there's a big difference between what you say when you are canvassing for the nomination and then campaigning for the presidency, you know, and the actual policies, you know. After 4 months of presidency, more or less, we can all see that the, you know, assessment of President Trump is, you know, much more is nicer than it was 4 months ago. You know, so there is a big difference between, you know, his real policies and what he said during the campaign. And I think that for a long time we have been measuring President Trump by what he said during the campaign, the 1+ year of the campaign. Now, you know, I'm going to focus on what I think for the Europeans is the most important point, which is NATO. After what we have seen, you know, NATO, do you agree with me, Secretary Dobriansky, that, you know, it is the most important legacy we ought to keep? You know, we of course must redefine the contribution of the member countries. We must perhaps reassess the objectives and policies of NATO. But don't you think this is the most important thing we have to keep, we have to care about it in the future?
Very direct answer, yes, absolutely. I said that in my remarks, so I repeat it again. I hope you heard it before. I said that NATO matters, and it is our values, our institutions, and our alliances that undergird the international liberal order. So yes, let me make a statement because of your statement. When I came today and we discussed what I would be speaking about, by the way, our original plan was for me to talk about US foreign policy globally and to give my perspective. So in this regard, I have been in foreign policy for over 25 years and in national security. We had a very heated campaign, and why I gave some snips, as we say, or little windows, because there were positions taken by both Republicans and Democrats that may not have been traditional, such as on trade, for example. So I tried to focus my remarks on where we are now, going forward. And that's why I tried to answer all of these questions in that context, not looking back at, as Anna would put it, she said, well, there's, use the word perceptions and reality. So I'm looking at where we are now. But answer your question again, absolutely. NATO is a crucial alliance. Our alliances do matter, and NATO matters greatly.
Many thanks for this great dialogue. My name is Carlota García Encina. I'm analyst at Elcano Royal Institute. My first question is about the Trump's team. Europeans are very happy with Mattis, very happy with McMaster, but I have some doubts about Tillerson because in questions, for example, why he couldn't choose his own deputy, or why he didn't held meetings with foreign leaders at the White House, or why Tillerson didn't protect the department from possible future budget cuts. The second question is about unpredictability. Trump thinks that his unpredictability is a strength, but I think that that's the worst message that you can say you can send to an ally, no? So this is a sort of strategy or something like that. Unpredictability, not. Sorry for me. Okay.
Oh, yes.
Okay, sorry. On the first question, when Secretary Tillerson, Rex Tillerson, was named to be Secretary of State, my reaction was that he is going to bring to that position some very important assets that some previous secretaries of state did not have. First, he knows many world leaders. He already doesn't have to take the time, as in our foreign ministries and our State Department, of getting to know who he's sitting across the table from. I saw that as a real asset, and see it as an asset. Secondly, he knows a great deal about the internal situation in many countries. He feels it from having worked in these countries. He knows it. It's not just from reading about it, which I think is a strength. Thirdly, in terms of the steps that he's taking at present, there are those who have said they understand the reason for it in terms of filling positions at the department. The reason why positions are not being filled is because there's a major review and they're going to restructure. Some positions will not exist any longer. So they don't want to appoint people to positions that then they will be moved away. I know that they're trying to do that with as much speed as possible. I think they need to move on that. My own view is, from having worked at the State Department, I'd like to see that moved forward because it has importance in terms of advancing foreign policy in a constructive and thoughtful and impactful way. And finally, on the first question, you also said, why was he maybe not at meetings? By the way, you know, not all secretaries of state go to every meeting of presidents. Just to know that. Some go, it depends what their schedule is. But if I had to look at, I think that Secretary Tillerson has played a major role on this trip, and also during the Chinese visit, also with going out to Asia to send a signal to some of our key allies. So I think that that has to be put in perspective, because you may not know, just because you're not at a meeting, that shouldn't be sending some signal. Your schedule may be requiring you to do something else. As for the question as to unpredictability, I'd say that you can argue there are some advantages and disadvantages. I think that for your friends and your allies, you do want predictability because you want to work together and you want to know what your course is. That's why I've mentioned to you, it's only the first 100 days, a little past. There is a national security strategy that's being written. I'll mention the name of the woman is Nadia Shadlow, who's someone who's an author, and who, by the way, McMaster wrote on her book on war and governance. I think it's important that we see what that strategy is and how we work it together. As for foes, there's some value in it, and that's one of the things that Trump has said. President Trump has said, he said, I don't always want to lay out what our steps are going to be, so a blueprint for action so that then it's known. He referred back to President Obama on those occasions. So that would be my answer to your question. I think that we need to be working collaboratively, collectively, and to show a show of strength. That's important.
Una allí y luego atrás, y tengo varias del público también que no olvido, de allí de atrás. Y terminaremos porque no podemos continuar mucho tiempo más. Adelante.
Thank you very much. My question will be for Secretary Dobriansky, although she has already answered all the questions. Oh, here. I am Fernando Lista. I am just a retired admiral in the Spanish Navy. I am going to take in an expression of the Minister Palacio that he used about perceptions. And you mentioned in different occasions the national security strategy. So just for not being very politician or being much in politics, what you can tell us about this national security strategy? What from your point of view, will be the main lines of this strategy in a real world? Thank you very much.
Maybe because Anna will say. But, okay. No, I don't have drafts. But let me say that the White House, the National Security Council, has, over the last month, has reached out to various think tanks. Anna Palacio is on the board and the executive committee of the Atlantic Council. I give one example of one institution, but they have reached out to a number of institutions to come to get views, to have some thinking, some dialogue about what should be in that strategy. I would say that if I had to predict, I think that certainly a key aspect of it will be, and because of your own past profession, as you said, or past work, that it will be about certainly first and foremost the preservation of the United States national security interests and those of our friends and neighbors, our friends and, and allies, our friends and allies. In this regard, you know that this administration has put resources into the Department of Defense, and the reason being is the view that our own deterrent value and capability has been diminished over the last 8 years, and also our political credibility. I think those kinds of issues will be the types of issues, for example, that will be addressed in this national security strategy. But I don't have any crystal ball on it, but I did want to say that I think what's important is they are reaching out to many of the foreign policy think tanks and also to the military, different military institutions to get various perspectives, which I think is a good thing before actually the writing of this strategy.
Do you think that this idea of leading from behind or the strategic patience is going to be kept in the new?
No. No, have you heard me? Definitively not. And I think for two reasons. First, because I think that although many Americans during our elections focused on domestic issues, first and foremost, the economy, etc., health issues, in this context, people do care about their security. I think with the acts of terrorism playing out, no less the recent tragedy in Manchester, England, I think that people are very concerned about what kind of deterrent do we have for these threats that are all around us. So in that sense, leading from behind does us no good. And for the reasons already Anna at the beginning stated very eloquently, the United States must lead. It must engage. And as I said, in my view, you can have America first, and you can also have America lead. And I think that's what we will see.
Thank you. I'm Ilana Mosseri. I'm an international relations professor at the Universidad Europea. And you can hear from my accent that I'm an American citizen. And so I just wanted to make a quick couple comments. Early in her presentation, Secretary Dobriansky mentioned that Trump won the women's vote. Actually not. The women's vote went 54% for Clinton, 42% for Trump. Trump won amongst white women. So it's important to make that distinction. Sure. So Clinton won 54% of the women's vote. Trump won 42%. He did not win the overall women's vote. He just won the white women's vote. That's an important distinction to make. Overall, women in the United States did not vote for Trump. And it's important that we remember that, right? I know a lot of hay was made over that after the election, and I had to explain that a lot of times. Another thing is that Trump's position on trade is a radical departure from Republican orthodoxy, which has always been very pro-trade. And actually, Bernie Sanders was very anti-trade as well, as he represented the very left wing of the Democratic Party. But Hillary Clinton really represented a much more traditional stance on trade of both the centrist Democrats and Republicans that's very pro-trade. So I don't think it's fair to say that they were alike on trade. And then just finally, one more thing. I think it really is important what presidential candidates say during their campaigns. And so we know why people have a perception that Trump is anti-Latin America. He got up, and on his very day he announced his candidacy, he called Mexicans rapists. I think it's important to remember that. That was one of the first things he said in his campaign. He said they are rapists. Very important. You can't say those things and not have repercussions in the world. And it's unfortunate for my country. For me, it's shocking. But I think it's important to remember where these roots lie and why people have these perceptions. Thank you.
Yes, of course, of course, of course.
You clearly, you know, we know where you're sitting based on your comments. So let me say this. I'm not a political pundit, okay? I'm not a political pundit. My profession is foreign policy, but let me say the first. On the first, genuinely, I heard that and saw that, I believe, on CNN. So on the issue about women. And I just remember it because it struck me, and I don't know what figures they used. So I could stand to be corrected. Maybe it depends on what poll one looks at, genuinely. And you're citing one. I just remember generally, but I'm not a political pundit, so I'm not going to challenge. Okay. Well, they maybe what I heard was not from that. So I'll give way on that. But on trade, I will say this. I do have a difference with you. By the way, my own personal position, and Anna could attest to this, is one as a supporter of free trade. I've been a supporter of TTIP and TPP, okay? But I will say it did surprise many of us during the election, and I feel I'm saying this objectively. In terms of Trump's position, I don't think that was the position he took or Bernie Sanders. That wasn't, I think, new to the public. But it was Hillary Clinton's, because she, in her capacity as Secretary of State, was so identified with those issues. And she challenged the content of the actual trade agreements. And her position may be somewhat different, but it surprised everyone that she did not take a forceful position. I will say that during the campaign. And finally, I will say, as I mentioned, I was not for today going to go back to statements made and the heat of the campaign. The campaign was heated, and there were many perspectives on what was said and how the public perceived it. To me, I wanted to come today to give you a view on where we are now on foreign policy and how I see it going forward.
Okay, and the final question, unavoidable on the impeachment. What are the possibilities of an impeachment of President Trump following the Russian connection and the compromise materials? I don't know. Who wants? Do you want to? No. You know, there is a special. There is a special council.
Anna, do you want to say a parting word?
No, this is not a party word. What I know, and this is technically as a lawyer, and I have studied, and there is an excellent, if someone is interested in this topic, there is an excellent publication, a long article, very technical. I think that we are not aware from outside United States how narrow the window to launch an impeachment process is. So this is what I can say. But as I think that this is my last time I can grab the phone, the micro, I will say two things. The first is not responding, but responding to you, Emilio, and to this professor of the Universidad. I think there is a big difference between a candidate and the presidency, and this is why I made and insisted this is the presidency of the United States of America, because this is an institution, and just President Trump is now this institution. While he was campaigning, he was not. And I don't remember the exact quote, but a quote that goes in this same direction by Johnson says, the presidency of the United States makes any man, no matter how small, bigger. And this is the transformation of just holding an institution. By the way, it's true whenever you are holding an institution. And this is why institutions matter, because it's not Donald Trump, it's the President of the United States of America, which means behind him all the checks and balances. And this is why I'm confident. Now, my two last words. Frankly, we want the Trump administration to succeed. And I think that this is pervasive in the world because of this indispensable country character of the United States. And frankly, Paula, well done. It's really chapeau.
Okay, Paula, final and last.
Okay. And by the way, as Anna indicates, we've worked together for a long time. I had the privilege of getting to know her when she was foreign minister. And she's not only held in high regard, but her views, and she is famous in the US because her views are very much respected. But what you said, our relationships do matter to me greatly, and thank you for your comment. On your question, let me say this. I'd first start with this point, which I think is important to keep in mind. Right now, I assume some of you may turn into our TV and watch or read our press. Political tensions are very, very high in the United States and in Washington, D.C. A discussion of this issue, I think, is very premature. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's very premature. And the reason why is because there are investigations ongoing, there are investigations underway, and I think that they need to take their course. I think that we need to be constructive and responsible in letting them take their course. And then that is the time at the end of that to take stock. But right now, it's way too premature. To speculate.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Creo que I fully agree with this answer right now. Muchísimas gracias a todos ustedes por acompañarnos. Tendremos más oportunidades de discutir y de charlar sobre la presidencia de Donald Trump en el futuro. Gracias por acompañarnos. Un aplauso para nuestras dos invitadas.